Mother were married. They both worked in North Springfield in the box factory. After they were married in 1890, they lived in a small house in North Springfield. That was where I was born in 1893. My father continued to work there for some time. The day I was born, it was stormy, and it was said that my grandmother came over there riding on a horse. The doctor that day was supposed to be Dr. Heselton. He came up from Springfield. Many people came in to see me because I was one of the first ones in the family, and they were anxious to see the new baby. Aunt Ruby, when working at the box factory, as well as others, used to put their name in some of the boxes. And once she had the name from the lady who wrote to her, whose name was Gladys. And Aunt Ruby wanted very much that my middle name should be Gladys. So that's the way it's hung to me all through the years. You would also like to know, too, I was born February 24, 1893. My father and grandfather built the house where we were born. We lived there for quite some time, and then my father decided he would like to live on a farm. So we moved probably 2 miles from North Springfield, in a little white house by the side of the road. We lived there for many years. Edward and Blanche were born at this home. This little house in North Springfield was near a brook, where sometimes children went fishing. But it was also it was near other houses, because my grandfather was a carpenter, and they built houses there in those days. Then the house further away from North Springfield, where we later lived, where Edward and Blanche were born, was a little white house beside the road. It was on a road towards Chester, which was some distance away. I liked it here, and my father was very glad to farm there. Sometimes there were heavy snowstorms in the winter. I can remember how my father looked one time as he was shoveling snow for a big drift so they could get the road open for people to pass by. From here, we used to go to North Springfield to shop, buy groceries as well as food, groceries which were not supplied by our needs at the farm. This store also sold cloth and sewing materials. My mother used to go there to pick out such items, because she used to make our clothes, which she always did. She liked to sew, and perhaps that's why that I liked to sew when I grew older. Once there was a program at the schoolhouse, which was perhaps half a mile away on the road towards Chester, and we were invited to go, although we were not old enough to go to school. And the first piece I ever spoke was like this, if I can remember it. Johnny played in the fire one day. He burned his hands and face. It was a shocking case. And of course they clapped their hands afterwards. That was my first appearance in public. I'm sure it was a snowy evening, but we all had a good time. After a few years on this farm, my father wanted to be near a town, and we moved toward North Springfield, perhaps half a mile from North Springfield, to a little house in the valley beside the brook, and here we lived for many years. I think Pearlie was born here. Once my father and mother built a playhouse for us. It was in the yard, a small place. It was a little building large enough for a table, a little red table and a chair. Here we used to play with our dolls. Very fond of flowers and always had them around. She enjoyed her gardens and used to make bouquets of flowers and take to the neighbors. In those days, we didn't think much of walking at least half a mile to another person's home. When there, we went to the Advent Church, where my Uncle Charles was sometimes the minister. My mother planted sunflowers and morning glories around this little playhouse we had. It was located just across the driveway and to the house, and was across the road from the woodshed, which was a part of the house. And you went from the woodshed into the kitchen. Below the house was a driveway to our home. This went past the house and past the barn, then on up to near the bridge, just before you entered the bridge. The playhouse, the bank went up to the main road that went on over the bridge towards Spoonerville and Treeball. Just beyond our driveway, up the hill a bit, the roads divided, and there were two, one to French Meadow and the other to Treeball or Spoonerville, and then on from there to Chester. Our barn was located just beyond the house. On the main floor of the barn was the stable for the horse, and underneath was a place for the cow and the hens and the pig when we had one. Over the stall where the horse was place for hay. Sometimes after the milking, my mother would take the milk in a pail and go across the bridge and to a woodland, which was at the right-hand side. That was where the cow was pastured. She would take the milk and put it in a box-like spring there and leave it for overnight for the cream to rise, because we didn't have any refrigerator in those days. Outside in the evening when it was beginning to be cool, we were always glad when my mother called us to supper, and one of the foods we liked for supper was what was called a pandowdy. It was a biscuit-like crust, quite thick, put over a pan that had apples in it. We were very fond of that. One summer, while we were still living here, I think I was 11 years old, and I wasn't very well, and my mother let me go to a cousin of mine who lived in Putney. She and her husband lived on a large farm there, and they had no children, and she was glad to have company. I took one of my dolls with me, and she made beautiful clothes for my doll while I was there. She had a doll and rabbits and a large farmhouse, and what a good time I had. First, when I went there, I was a bit homesick because I missed my brother and sister. Lady Eunice was the daughter of my mother's sister, Polly. I was there for 1 whole month, and when I came back to my own home and to see my mother and sisters, the garden had grown so much, and the flowers were so pretty. Something I used to do when my father was taking care of his land that he had on the plain. Up the hill, a short distance across the bridge, one went up the hill to a large section of land where families from North Springfield and others who didn't have much land had sections of land up there. My father raised potatoes and corn. I used to like to ride the horse when my father was cultivating the rows of corn and potatoes. I rode the horse and guided it between the rows so that the horse would not step on whatever was growing. I was a little girl. I had a sewing basket, which I thought a great deal of, and my mother used to cut out pieces of calico for me to make a quilt. One day I was given a bright blue spool thread. We didn't have colored thread in those days. Everything was done with black and white thread. One Sunday morning I brought out my basket, ready to sew, and my mother said to me, "We don't do this on Sunday. We don't sew on Sunday." So ever since then, never on a Sunday have I sewed unless it seemed to be necessary something that needed very much to be done. Now I'm going to skip way a long time later. When I was going to school in North Springfield in the 8th grade, Mr. Kendall was our teacher. At this time, we were reading the story of Everett Hale's story of the Man Without a Country. Mr. Roscoe, the superintendent, was visiting that day, and we were discussing it at that time. Do you remember the story? So it were like this. There lives a man with soul so dead, who never to himself has said, "This is my own, my native land," when he was returning from a foreign shore. And Mr. Roscoe seemed somewhat impressed by me, perhaps. I often wondered. But anyway, it wasn't long after that, when he came again, he said he'd like to have me live with them to go to high school. I often wondered how I was going to get to high school, because we didn't have buses in those days. But Mr. Roscoe said, "You may come and live with us while you go to high school." They had a little girl 6 years old, and at times I was to help take care of her, and to sit when they wished to go out in the evening. And so when it came fall time, my grandfather hitched up the horse into the small buggy which he had, and probably I had a suitcase, and I was taken to the Roscoe home on Orchard Street. Here I lived with them for 3 years until Mr. Roscoe had a better position offered in Barry. And Mrs. Roscoe said to me, if I would go with them from Springfield to Barry, and this would have been my last year in high school, where I would have liked to have stayed and graduated from Springfield High School. But I was, Mrs. Roscoe said that if I went with them, she would see that I had a scholarship to go to Castleton Normal School, and that was where students are prepared to teach school. So I couldn't resist and went with them to Barry. That fall, there was an epidemic of, everybody was vaccinated for that, which is quite a time that we didn't feel well from this vaccination, which seemed to be necessary. I was quite homesick when I was there, but not so much as when I was in Springfield. And I should have told her this first. I hadn't been away from my grandmother since I'd lived there for 2 years, and to be away from home, I was really homesick at the Roscoes. But after 1 month, I could go home and see my grandparents. My family was living in Zion City at that time, so I lived with my grandmother. But I was most pleased when my grandfather came for me that afternoon to take me home with them for over the weekend. When in Barry, I had to make new friends because they didn't easily accept someone coming from somewhere else to be with them. But I was there to graduate from the Barry High School in 1913. I graduated from the grades in 1909, but this was from Barry. For our graduation clothes, we had what we called a white sailor suit. On graduation night, we wore a white bow, and for class day, we had a red one. I went out with a group of girls one afternoon, just for pleasure and to have the Sunday afternoon off. It was the first time I'd ever seen girls smoking. That was quite new to me. It was offered to me, but I refused. After I graduated from high school, I came back to my grandmother's and worked at Mr. Field's for the summer. I think I went there to work when I graduated from the grades, because I wanted to earn money to help me while I was in Castleton, because my parents were not able to help me, and I received $1 a week for working when I was there. I helped get the meals, although I never did any baking, and Miss Field sometimes made cookies, and I used to see them lying on the shelf as she was baking, but she never offered me one. And I sometimes think of that when I have my layout of cookies, when I offer some to somebody. Castleton, we were to furnish our own sheets, pillowcases. The Fields' son, who was a judge in Massachusetts, used to come for the summer, and before he left to go back to his work, one day he came out to the kitchen and very shyly offered me $2. He said, that will help to buy some of your sheets or pillowcases, which was very nice of him because I really hadn't earned very much money. Now that I had finished work there, I went back to my grandmother's and got ready for school. Where a trunk was found from someplace and brought out, and I was busy packing my trunk to go to school in early September. My grandfather and grandmother were very much excited about it. In those days, we went from North Springfield to Gassett's with a vehicle drawn by a horse, or sometimes 2 horses, but usually 1 horse. And we met at the North Springfield store to get into this vehicle. But when there was somebody at a home who wished to be picked up, they drove around and came that day that I was to go to school and picked up my trunk at my grandfather's. My grandfather was very excited that morning. He went to the post office and waited for the, as we called it, the stage to come. The stage was coming from Springfield and going to Gassett's. And so he watched that morning for the stage to come. And I believe he rode with the stage man back to his house where my trunk was for me to go. Then it was to Gassett's and to take the train. I had not ridden in a train for quite some time, so it was really very exciting. Going to Rutland, from there we went by trolley to Castleton. I don't remember at all how our trunks were transferred, and I'm not sure, but I think it was a steam train. It wasn't an electric train those days, and yet I don't remember. Perhaps some of my books will tell whether it was electric or a steam train, but I think it was a regular large train from Rutland to Castleton, where the trunks were taken. And when I got there were many others, too, who were going to this college. In those days, we called it a normal school. There were 150 students there that year. Some of them came from Rutland and New Haven. They came by day and did not stay in the dormitory for overnight. The girl I stayed with the first year was from Woodstock. And in our room for heating, there was a little stove, which was used as soon as the weather grew cold. The wood was piled in the hallway, and we took it from there and kept our own little fires. One day, something went wrong with our little stove, and there wasn't a fire in it. But anyway, it went down to the floor in a bang, and our room was not far from over the principal's office. He came rushing up to the room to see what had happened. He was quite excited about it, but it did no harm, and we cleaned up what needed to be done. All that I was in Castleton, a cousin of the family who lived in Saratoga Springs telephoned to me one Thanksgiving and said he would pay my fare if I could go home with him to my grandfather's for the Thanksgiving. And I was very much excited about it because I expected to stay at the school where many other girls were staying, and planned what we were going to do for those few holidays that we had. But my cousin, George Wilkins, met me in Rutland, and from there we took the train to Gassett's. And it was snowing that evening, and it was sleighing, which was unusual for that time of year. But I can remember the sleigh ride from Gassett's to North Springfield, where we were to spend the few holidays, which were Thanksgiving, where I was at my grandmother's. Last long. So when we went back to take the train again, it was a buggy it was a stage that we went on to Gassett's, to Gassett's to take the train. But I'd had a very wonderful time, and it was good to be away from school for a few days to see my family. Castleton, to earn a little bit of extra money, I waited on table every other week at this was help me to earn a bit of money. Some of the girls did other kinds of work. Sometimes I would go out in the evening to wait on table and wash the dishes afterwards. Then I would receive 50 cents. Another exciting time was at Castleton was early in the morning, after breakfast, or before breakfast, but perhaps it was, I don't know, I don't remember just when. But anyway, some of us used to go to the post office, which was not far away, to see whether we had any mail that morning. Then we went back to our studies. As my brother Edward would help me with a bit of money. He was working in the shop at that time, and he was glad to help me a bit. And I was there for 2 years, graduating in 1915. That summer, I went with the Cases to Oak Bluffs to work for them for the summer. My cousin Irma had been working for them, but this time we exchanged. She was going to work at the Fieldses, and I was going to the beach with the Cases. Way to New Bedford, where we took the boat to Oak Bluffs. The Cases stopped on the way for overnight, and we stayed at a home where there were 2 girls about my age, and I had a very fine time that evening. The next day we were taking the car. This time the Ford car was on its way to New Bedford. So the Cases was 2 years old, and so I was to help with them and to help with the housework, mostly to do dishes and help get the meals. Scholarship to Castleton was for part of the being there was to teach in a district school. There were 3 of us girls there at that time. Besides the scholarship we had, we were to say that we would teach 2 years in a district school. My first teaching was at the Goulds Mills School in Springfield, 3 miles below Springfield. There was a trolley, so that quite occasionally after school I could ride up to Springfield, do some errands, and to go to the library. It was quite an experience for me to have a little bit more money to spend, and I think that I paid $4 a week for room and board. It was at the Wireless, and they had a nice Jersey cow there, and I enjoyed very much the milk. I thought it was quite wonderful. It was an elderly lady who prepared the meals. I enjoyed my years there and made many friends. Some are still my friends today. After I'd been there, that the cow disappeared, and finally I found out this cow had tuberculosis, but it was not supposed to hurt the milk which we drank. Cisco told me to do this. She used to be a teacher too, and when one of the little boys one day was making spitballs and spitting them around to hit somebody in the schoolroom, and so I gave him a little box and some paper so that he could make some spitballs, but to put them in the box after he'd finished. He really was tired before he finished and never made any more spitballs. Sometimes for the weekend I would take the trolley to Springfield and then walk to North Springfield to spend the weekend with my grandparents. Then I could hire a lady to take me Sunday afternoon back to Goulds Mills, where I was teaching. It may sound very sketchy, but it was much easier perhaps to write in more of the details, but this gives a little bit of the way it was from the time I graduated from the grades until I graduated from Castleton Normal School. My second year of teaching was at West Springfield. That school I enjoyed very much. It was near a brook, and the children were quite different. They were farm children, and it was while I was there that we had a hot lunch. The Outer Inn Club gave us a little oil stove, which was heated with a bit of kerosene, and the children brought milk, and we made cocoa and had a hot lunch. It was something new in those days to have a hot lunch at noontime. When I walked from Springfield to North Springfield, it was rather a blizzardy, cold day, and my grandparents would hardly believe that I had walked. But it did me good, perhaps, and I kept warm in walking. While in Goulds Mills, I went to the Teachers' Convention, which was in Rutland. Virginia Slack went with me. She was also a teacher in Springfield, and while the convention was for more than one day, we went to Castleton, where we stayed all night. Very sketchy, but it's a little bit of what happened during my days from the graduation from the North Springfield School until I went to Castleton. 2 years of teaching. Club of Springfield recommended that I be given a scholarship to go to Castleton Normal School for 2 years if I would teach in a district school for 2 years. There were other girls also at Castleton. The year before I went to Castleton, I worked in the Fields home. I was there for summers each year after I was in Castleton to earn some money to buy what few things I needed for school. We were to furnish our own sheets and pillowcases, and I had a pleasant summer working at the Fieldses. I learned a great deal while I was there. Afternoons I would spend at my grandmother's. And after I graduated from Castleton, I went to Goulds Mills to teach. That was a town about 2 or 3 miles south of Springfield and near the Black River. I had a very pleasant room at the Wileys, and I shall always remember the roses that were on the wallpaper of the room. In those days we did not have a bathroom, but the lady each morning would set a pitcher of water on the hall, which I would pick up and use in my room for getting washed. I enjoyed her very much, and she was an older lady, and each afternoon or evening she would sometimes go to the parlor, as we called it in those days, and play the piano. This was my first time of ever earning as much as $4 a week for anything, and so I think I enjoyed the privilege of this money to spend. Oh, but I didn't. That was $4, which I paid for my room and board. But I think that I received $12 in pay each week. And quite often I used to go in a trolley after school up to Springfield to do errands and then come back. And I enjoyed this very much, which sometimes perhaps I didn't need. And then I would take the trolley on the weekends to Springfield, and then find some other way to go to North Springfield to spend perhaps the weekend with my grandparents. There was one wintry day when I walked from Springfield to the 3 miles to North Springfield on this snowy day, when I reached my grandmother's home, she could hardly believe that I had walked that distance. I should remember when I was still at the Wileys, in the yard, they used to pasture a Jersey cow, and we had wonderful milk to drink there. But it wasn't very long before that cow disappeared. We finally found out that it was TB, which the cow had, and had to be taken care of. My grandmother's, and wanted to go back to school to teach where I was teaching in Goulds Mills. I used to hire a lady to take her horse and carriage and take me back to school at Goulds Mills, because at that hour of the day there were no trolleys running. and she used to charge me, I think it was $1 for taking me back there. The little boy there in school who made spitballs and spit them around and across the room to some of the pupils. So I thought one day I would just stop that. So I gave him a box and a piece of paper and told him to make spitballs, which he did for quite a few minutes. He really got tired doing it and never did it again. There were 3 girls from a Johnson family in school. Each one of those I enjoyed. One of them, especially Pamela, is still a friend of mine after I had grown up way into my 80s, and I used to see her in club work after that, and we sometimes reminded each other of the school days. One Christmas she was one of the ones who helped me get ready for a Christmas program at school. I'd taken my mother to the hospital for her blood transfusion. After that, I went to the Home Efficiency Club meeting, which is at Peggy Beardsley. Her home was a short distance off the main road. We had a very fine, interesting meeting that day. I think it was before Christmas, and there was a good number there, and we had a fine program, and I shall remember the dinner, because it was fish chowder, and for dessert was pumpkin pie. During this meeting, it began to rain. It was cold, and began to freeze. Ice froze on the cars and in the road, and it looked as though it was very treacherous traveling. 2 men came and put chains on some of the cars so that we could get home. I did not try to get home, but I went into town. There, I was to have supper with one of the ladies, for in the evening I had a meeting at the hotel. It was an Alturian pre-Christmas meeting, and we were expecting a goodly number there that evening. But anyway, I had dinner or supper, whichever you wish to call it, at Mrs. Hill's. Then I took the car and went down the street and left the car for Milton to pick it up. Then he could take the car and go home. The lady for the program that evening had come from Concord. It was quite a distance for her to come, and we phoned and tried to call her and said it was not good traveling, she better not come. We could not get her, but she came on time for the meeting. She told her Christmas stories, and we asked her if she couldn't stay all night. She said no, she had to board a plane the next morning for Washington. After the meeting, I was to meet Robert. He was to pick me up in the street, which he did. It was still, as I remember, the storm had ceased, but the roads were extremely icy. Robert and I started towards the French Meadow Road. We thought that would be the easiest one to get home, because the other roads were long hills and would be likely very difficult to travel on. After we'd gone a short distance on the road, the car swerved and went straight across the road. Here we stopped. Robert phoned the police where we were and would like them to come and help him to turn the car around so that we could start once more for home. While we were there, we had brought cookies from the meeting, which were left over, and Robert and I had a fine visit, one of the finest I think we ever had, because here we were with nothing else to do except eat cookies and talk. During the time we were there, Robert once said, "I think my father is walking the floor wondering where we are." But after some time, we did get home. It was winter time, and one Sunday, it may have been near Easter time, probably it was Easter, when Gertrude and Ruth wanted very much to go to church. So they dressed up in their warm winter clothes, and although it was Easter, it was no time for Easter, warmer clothes for Easter. When they got to church, they really felt quite embarrassed when they saw the pretty clothes that other young people were wearing. But they always went to church when they could possibly get there. There was one time when Robert was the only one to go to church, and there was quite a bit of snow. But he put his skis on and went along down to church. There was also another story about Robert. A neighbor boy once asked him to do something on a Sunday morning. Robert said, "I can't today. This is the day we go to church." It was in 1927 when I learned to drive a car. Robert was born that spring, but a lady came to the house. We took the car, and she taught me to drive. And then after that, I was able to take the family and go to church. Before this time, Milton had taken us until I had a license to drive. And we always went to church, when possibly we could, church and Sunday school. And for a long time, I taught a Sunday school class and had a program between the sermon and the Sunday school time, when young people took part in the opening service. Mother's Day, my Sunday school group and I gathered wildflowers and made corsages to give to the mothers on Mother's Day. They were homemade, but they were really quite a thoughtful gift. The Sunday school classes had what was called a class meeting once a month. Each class met in one of the members' homes for an evening of fun, games, and refreshments. And they had such a nice time getting together. They repeat, but I did enjoy being leader of a 4-H group for 5 years. And all of my children who were old enough, beyond the age of 10, were members of this group. We met once a month, and it was homemaking programs which we had, besides the fun they had of getting together. Then at the end of the year, there was a little booklet which was filled out, which answered questions showing their improvement and achievements during the year. Then in the fall, there was what was called a roundup meeting, where all the groups of the county got together, and we met in some special place. I remember once meeting in White River Junction and going to the bakery shop, where everyone was interested in the baking of foods. The fall of 1916, I came to West Springfield to teach school. It was a little schoolhouse near the brook, a lovely little place, and I enjoyed the birds there all the year, and the children did too. Now, I think I had 16. It's hard to remember the number that I had because it was so long ago, and I do have it in a diary probably, if I could look it up way back to those years. It was a pleasant place to be, and I had enjoyed the place where I boarded. It was a man and wife, and Mrs. Lawrence, the lady, put up the nicest lunches for me. There was a black lunchbox which I carried. In this lunchbox was nice sandwiches of homemade bread, and she made very good bread. She was a very good cook. There was this half pint of milk, and then there was also a small jar which had something rather special in it each day. Not always the same. Sometimes it was applesauce, and sometimes I was surprised by its being syrup. But it was always good. Now, it was a short distance from this place to the schoolhouse, and Mr. Lawrence used to say that when I was walking, it was just a flash across the screen. Then, while I was there, we had a little stove given to us by the Altorian Club, which we could use, a little kerosene stove for heating food. The children brought the milk, and they also supplied the cocoa, and we made warm cocoa. And I think sometimes we had some creamed potato while I was there. But anyway, the children had something warm for lunch, which was really something new in a school place like that. There was one boy one day who cut this post down where people could hitch the horses. I don't know why he did it, but he really probably did. It was fun. Anyway, he had to dig a hole and reset the post ready for next time. Well, it was winter, and there was a winter of 1917, and I always enjoyed posting, whether it was at home on the crust or anywhere else. Well, there was someone who brought what we called a Travis over there one evening, and there were, let's see, there was Florence Armstrong, and a girl with Gladys Fulham, and a young man, boy, and I, who were sliding, and we were sliding in the main road because at that time there wasn't traffic enough to make it so we couldn't do it. So we went up quite a long hill, and we could slide a long ways. Well, on the way down, near a curve, Mrs. Peters and her son Pearlie were coming, and they had a horse and sleigh. It was only 2 ruts in the road for them, and so we just ran right into them because they were just coming around the curve, and we didn't see them. And the Travis that I was on went right in the side of that sleigh. So that ended that trip, and we had to get out and go to the Armstrong home nearby because I was hurt. My head had hit the side of the sleigh, although I did have on a winter cap that was quite thick. But anyway, they got me up there to the Armstrong house, and they did have a telephone, and called the only doctor we could get, and it was Dr. Denman. And I had a cut across the left eye, and Dr. Denman put in 3 or 4 stitches to sew it up. And Mr. Armstrong held the lamp while he was doing it. It was several days after that before the coloring had gone from my face. I was really a sight when I went out on the street. You just couldn't give any reason for people not looking at me and wondering what was the matter with me. While I was, the next morning after this had happened, I couldn't even eat my breakfast. I suppose my nerves were badly damaged. Anyway, I didn't know what it was that caused this all over me when all that I hurt was my head. While I was there, my sister, who was taking the teacher training course, came in and taught school for me. She enjoyed that very much. Days before I was better. When my mother came to see me that morning, I was hurt. My Uncle Charles brought her. He lived nearby. And then there's a story about Uncle Charles, too. He was not an ordained minister, but he went around to different churches or different towns to preach. That was the way they expressed it, to preach. And he was an Advent. And sometimes he preached at the Advent church in North Springfield. One time, when there were so few people around, he preached to an empty church, except for his wife who was there. But there was something in the laws of that church that it must be kept open. Someone must be there every Sunday to preach a sermon. It was many years later, maybe, or not. Yes, it was before this time when I was living at my grandparents', when I was probably 14 years old and going to the school in North Springfield, that Uncle Charles would be away for the weekend to preach somewhere. And my Aunt Lena needed somebody to stay with her all night. And I used to get 50 cents for going to stay all night with her. This was a completing of my teaching in a one-room schoolhouse. Well, I wanted to go out of town to teach where I didn't know people, because people say you're famous if you're going to be famous, or it's better for you to get away from your own hometown. So I joined an agency and finally went to Peterborough, New Hampshire to teach. Where was I said that? I'll repeat that because I think I had it off at that time. I went to Peterborough, New Hampshire to teach. I went by train from Gassetts, I think it was, to Winchendon. Then from there, I had to change to go to Peterborough, New Hampshire. And the superintendent met me there at the station and took me to a place to board. Well, this wasn't so pleasant a place. The next day, I went to another place, which I enjoyed very much. There was older people, and I had just a room there and had to go eat somewhere else. At this place, town, where I met Milton Baker, who was later my husband, he had come up there with a group of telephone people. They were installing the equipment in a new telephone office built there. He and several other men. He came one day to the place where I was eating to come there for his own meals. Around the country with a horse and buggy, which was a pleasant afternoon's journey. Many times around the roads there. It was a pretty little town. I helped with the Girl Scouts while I was there also, and also attended church. I'd never been many times to the country, and so he wasn't used to the animals there. And one afternoon when we were walking, there was a herd of cows being taken home. He started for the side of the road and said, "Aren't you coming?" Which I soon did. The 18th of February, when Milton was sat at the table and I met him, it was a year after that when we were married on that same day at my parents' home in Spoonerville. In Peterborough in the springtime, I went to Providence, Rhode Island to see where he lived and to meet his mother. I stayed there for a few days. And then early one morning, we went to the station, and Milton and I came to North Springfield to meet my parents. I stayed with my parents until I was married, when it was fall. Then for a few days I taught school in North Springfield while one teacher was ill. Good time that summer. I'd never really been having an opportunity of visiting a friend of mine in Burlington. She had lived as a neighbor to us when I was a little girl, and I went there in the summer for a few days. We had a most delightful time. One day we went for a ride on Lake Champlain, which was most delightful. On my way home, I stopped in Barrie to visit the lady where I had lived. I had lived with her in Springfield when I was going to high school. I lived with the superintendent there and his wife. He had died, but I went there and visited them. She told me I had matured, which would be a natural comment for her to make. And this is mixed up, but it's only a bit of conversation as I think back to these days. It's not a continuous story. I was married. We went to live with Milton and his mother in Providence. He had a work position nearby. Some mornings I used to like to walk to work with him. I enjoyed going to walk in the city and learning about places. His mother had an accident at some time which had injured her in some ways so that she was different from many people. She did not wish for her sister to meet me or other people, so it was very difficult for me to make friends there. All after we were married, she died in November. A very sudden illness. Wanted to live in the country. So after that, we began to talk more and more about where we'd like to live. It finally ended up by going to North Springfield and finding a place near my parents. He thought he could be a farmer and in that way earn our living. We were married in 1918, and in 1925 he went into the gear shaper to work because we needed more money. When he went, he had cotton. Some of the farm ways. We had cows there that needed to be milked each day, and he drove a horse and buggy to work. At that time, we didn't have a car. It was 1925 when he went into the gear shaper to work. The morning he went to work, or one of those mornings, he said, well, I don't have time to milk the cow, and I have never milked, but I knew I needed milk for children, and so I went out and milked the cow. Times after that, too, but usually we had somebody who lived with us who could do it when he had to go to work.